What if everything you think you know about the Wild West's most famous revolver is a lie? Wyatt Earp's legendary long-barreled revolver. Fiction. The so-called six-shooter? Most gunfighters only carried 5 rounds. And the famous .45 short Colt? It never even existed. For more than a century, movies, novels, and marketing campaigns have turned the Colt Single Action Army into a legend. But the truth is far stranger and a lot less glamorous than the myths you've been told. Today, we're busting 11 of the biggest misconceptions about the Peacemaker, starting with one of the most persistent mistakes in firearms history. Myth number 11, the Long Colt cartridge. But before we dive into the biggest lies, let's start with a confusion that trips up even gun experts. You walk into a gun store and ask for .45 Long Colt ammunition and unknowingly perpetuate a myth that's over a century old. In the 1870s, the U.S. Army faced a logistical nightmare that would shape firearms terminology forever. They had Colt revolvers that used one cartridge and Smith & Wesson Schofields that used a shorter one. The solution seemed simple: label the longer ammunition to avoid confusion. The Army created the term .45 Long Colt to differentiate it from the shorter .45 Schofield round. It was purely administrative, a bureaucratic band-aid to keep soldiers from grabbing the wrong ammunition in the heat of combat. The Quartermaster Corps stamped boxes and requisition forms with this designation, thinking they were solving a practical problem. But here's the catch that fooled generations: there never was a .45 short Colt. The proper name has always been simply .45 Colt. The long designation stuck around long after the Schofield faded into historical footnotes, creating a phantom cartridge name that haunts gun counters to this day. Today, manufacturers still print .45 Long Colt on ammunition boxes, perpetuating a mistake born from 19th century military bureaucracy. You're not buying a different cartridge, you're buying into linguistic archaeology. Every time you ask for .45 Long Colt, you're speaking the language of supply sergeants who died before your grandfather was born. Speaking of things that sound impressive but miss the mark entirely. Myth number 10, the elite weapon, fantasy. You picture the Peacemaker as an expensive status symbol, the Rolex of revolvers, but you're dead wrong about who could afford one. In 1873, America was rebuilding after a devastating civil war that had torn the nation apart. The frontier was expanding westward like a slow-moving avalanche, and working men needed reliable tools they could actually afford. Colt understood this market reality and priced the Peacemaker accordingly. At $17 by mail order, the Peacemaker was accessible to the average working man scraping together a living on the frontier. To put this in perspective, a marshal like Wild Bill Hickok earned $150 per month, making the gun cost roughly 3 days' wages for a well-paid lawman. For a cowboy earning $30 monthly, it represented significant investment, but not impossible luxury. The real expensive items were the exceptions, not the rule. Only 1% of Peacemakers rolled off the production line with engraving or decoration. The truly expensive versions, the pearl-handled, gold-inlaid showpieces that cost $100, were custom orders for wealthy clients seeking to make statements. Hollywood created the myth of the expensive gunslinger's weapon through decades of films featuring ornate revolvers carried by larger-than-life heroes. In reality, the Peacemaker was the working man's revolver, reliable, affordable, and built to last through years of hard use. The elite fantasy came later, through cinema and collectors who transformed everyday utility into aspirational luxury. But while we're talking about what's real versus what's Hollywood, if you're enjoying these myth-busting discoveries, don't forget to hit that like button. It tells us you want more hidden history like this. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss our next dive into the real stories behind the Wild West's most legendary weapons. Myth number 9, the Magnum Force delusion. You expect the .45 Colt to hit like thunder from the gods. Instead, you get the ballistics of a gentle giant that whispers rather than screams. In 1873, black powder was the only game in town, and chemistry limited what even the best engineers could achieve. The original Army load used 40 grains of black powder behind a heavy 255-grain lead bullet, pushing it at a respectable 1,050 feet per second. On paper, this looked impressive. In practice, there was a problem that would reshape the cartridge's destiny. The .45 Colt delivered reliable stopping power with what should have been manageable recoil. It was designed to drop a man or a horse with authority, using heavy lead bullets that transferred energy efficiently upon impact. The ballistics looked good in testing, but soldiers told a different story. The recoil was simply too much for the average trooper to handle effectively in combat situations. Accuracy suffered when men flinched from the punishment their own weapons delivered. The Army's solution was pragmatic, but devastating to the cartridge's reputation. They quickly reduced the powder charge to just 28 grains, dropping velocity to a more sedate 855 feet per second. This made it less powerful than many people believe to this day. Modern .45 Colt ammunition develops roughly the same energy as .45 ACP, about 400 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. The myth of devastating power comes from Hollywood, not history books. Your gentle giant hit hard enough to matter, but it wasn't the hand cannon of silver screen legend. And speaking of things that could hurt you more than help you, myth number 8, the 6-shooter fallacy. You count 6 chambers and assume you're carrying 6 shots ready for action. But experienced gunfighters knew better than to tempt fate with fully loaded cylinders. The 1870s were the golden age of mechanical simplicity, when engineers built things to work rather than to be foolproof. The Peacemaker embodied this philosophy with brutal honesty. No safety mechanisms, no transfer bars, no hammer blocks. Just precisely machined steel, carefully tempered springs, and the unforgiving laws of physics. The gun was built tough and elegantly simple. Cock the hammer with your thumb, squeeze the trigger, and physics took over. Reload through a loading gate on the right side of the frame, feeding cartridges one at a time into the cylinder. This was pure mechanical reliability in its most honest form. But this simplicity came with a deadly catch that killed more than one careless gunfighter. Drop the revolver on its hammer, bump it wrong against a doorframe, or catch the hammer spur on your clothing, and the gun would fire without warning. The firing pin was machined as part of the hammer itself, always resting directly on the primer of whichever cartridge sat in the chamber beneath it. Smart gunfighters developed a survival ritual that became frontier gospel. Load one chamber, skip the next, then load the remaining 4. This load 1, skip 1, load 4 mantra meant carrying only 5 shots instead of 6. You had to choose between maximum firepower and keeping your kneecaps intact. The 6th shot simply wasn't worth the risk of accidentally ventilating your own leg. But even if you carried it safely, was it really the gun everyone used? Myth number 7, the universal sidearm. Illusion. You imagine every cowboy, lawman, and outlaw carrying a Peacemaker, holstered on their hip. But the frontier was far more diverse than Hollywood's casting directors would have you believe. After the Civil War ended in 1865, America was literally flooded with surplus military revolvers gathering dust in government warehouses. Thousands of cap and ball Colts, Remingtons, and other makes were dumped onto the civilian market at bargain basement prices. The frontier economy ran on pragmatism, not brand loyalty or fashion statements. Colt produced a respectable 357,859 first-generation Single Action Army revolvers from 1873 all the way through 1940. It was undeniably a solid, reliable design that earned genuine respect through consistent performance in harsh conditions. But numbers don't lie, and the numbers tell a different story than the movies. Smith & Wesson was simultaneously making superior revolvers that solved the Colt's most glaring weakness. Their Model 3 American could be reloaded in mere seconds. Simply break it open at the hinge, and an automatic ejector kicked out all 6 spent shells simultaneously. Reload with fresh cartridges, snap it shut, and you were back in action. The Colt required tedious one-by-one extraction and loading that left you vulnerable. Many famous frontiersmen, including the legendary Wyatt Earp himself, actually carried Smith & Wesson revolvers when it mattered most. The Peacemaker's supposed dominance is largely a Hollywood creation that ignores market realities. It was simply one tool among many in a diverse ecosystem of firearms, not the universal choice that popular history pretends it was. Speaking of things Hollywood got wrong about what people actually used. Myth number 6. The 45 Colt vs. 45 ACP mix-up. You hear someone mention 45 Colt and immediately think of the famous 1911 pistol, and you've just fallen headlong into a linguistic trap that's confused shooters for over a century. In 1905, the brilliant John Moses Browning designed the 45 automatic Colt pistol cartridge for his revolutionary new semi-automatic pistol. This created an awkward situation. 2 completely different 45 caliber cartridges from the same manufacturer, separated by 32 years of technological evolution, but forever linked by corporate branding. The 45 ACP was shorter, rimless, and specifically designed for semi-automatic pistols that fed ammunition from detachable magazines. The 45 Colt was longer, rimmed, and built for revolvers with swing-out or loading gate cylinders. They were different tools engineered for completely different mechanical systems, but confusion was inevitable from the start. People began calling 45 ACP ammunition 45 Colt in casual conversation simply because both cartridges bore the Colt name and shared the same caliber designation. This linguistic confusion persists with stubborn determination even today. Gun store clerks across America still deal with customers who walk in, assuming they're purchasing the same cartridge under different names. They're not remotely interchangeable. Attempt to load 45 ACP ammunition in a Peacemaker, and you'll discover feeding problems and reliability issues. Try cramming 45 Colt cartridges into a 1911 magazine, and they simply won't fit properly. You're dealing with 2 completely different ammunition types that happen to share a manufacturer's name and a caliber measurement, nothing more. But while we're talking about what came first in the evolution of firearms, myth number 5. The Colt invented it. Fantasy. You automatically credit Colt with inventing the cartridge revolver concept, but you're giving them undeserved credit for someone else's revolutionary breakthrough. From 1855 through 1869, Smith & Wesson held the ironclad Rollin' White patent on bored-through cylinders, the fundamental technology that made metallic cartridge revolvers possible. This legal monopoly meant that only Smith & Wesson could manufacture revolvers capable of firing the new self-contained metallic cartridges that were transforming warfare. During this crucial 14-year period, Colt was legally trapped in the technological past, forced to continue manufacturing obsolete cap and ball revolvers while their primary competitor sold thousands of advanced cartridge guns to military and civilian buyers. Smith & Wesson made their fortune during the Civil War, selling cartridge revolvers to officers who understood that metallic cartridges meant faster reloading, better weather resistance, and superior reliability under combat conditions. When the Rollin-White patent finally expired on April 4, 1869, Colt scrambled to join the cartridge revolution that had passed them by. The Peacemaker wasn't revolutionary technology that changed the world. It was Colt's desperate attempt to reclaim market share they had lost through legal constraints rather than engineering failures. They succeeded through superior marketing campaigns, aggressive military contracting, and manufacturing excellence, but not through innovation. Sometimes being second to market means being better engineered, but it doesn't mean being first with the breakthrough idea.
Otherwise, I'm just gonna have to step over there and slap you around, son.
You're celebrating a comeback story, not a technological revolution. And speaking of those crucial military contracts, myth number 4, the best gun won assumption. You naturally assume the Army chose the Peacemaker because it was obviously the best revolver available for military service. But military procurement has always been about politics, logistics, and economics rather than pure performance. In 1872, the U.S. Army desperately needed a new service revolver to replace aging cap and ball models that had served since the Civil War. Multiple manufacturers submitted competing designs for comprehensive testing. The competition was fierce, the potential contracts enormous, and the stakes couldn't have been higher for the companies involved. The Colt design was undeniably solid, mechanically reliable, and met basic military specifications without major flaws. It could handle the new .45 Colt cartridge effectively and proved durable during field testing under harsh conditions. However, many experienced officers who actually had to use these weapons in combat situations preferred the Smith & Wesson Model 3 Schofield, which offered faster reloading capabilities and was arguably more sophisticated mechanically. But the Army had already made substantial investments in .45 Colt ammunition production facilities and logistics systems. The bureaucratic aftermath proved that superior doesn't always mean successful in military procurement. The Army eventually created a logistical nightmare by attempting to field 2 different .45 caliber cartridges simultaneously, the longer .45 Colt and the shorter .45 Schofield. They ultimately solved this self-created problem by dropping the longer .45 Colt cartridge entirely, standardizing on the shorter Schofield round instead. The supposedly superior gun lost the ammunition war through bureaucratic reshuffling rather than battlefield performance. But even with mixed military success, surely the gun dominated civilian markets because it was better manufactured? Who would have thought that one of the most famous Wild West legends never even happened? I'd love to hear your take. Drop a comment with the biggest myth you believed before watching this. We read everyone, and we might even feature your thoughts in a future video. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe and join our growing community of frontier history fans. Myth number 3, the mass production misconception. You picture massive Colt factories churning out Peacemakers by the thousands, flooding the expanding frontier with reliable revolvers, but the actual production numbers tell a completely different story than popular imagination suggests. The period from the 1870s through the 1940s represented the golden age of American firearms manufacturing, when multiple companies competed fiercely for both military contracts and the growing civilian market across an expanding nation. Colt's prestigious Hartford factory employed the most advanced manufacturing techniques available during this era. Each revolver was precisely fitted by skilled craftsmen, featured interchangeable parts that could be swapped between guns, and underwent quality control processes that ensured consistent performance. The manufacturing standards were genuinely impressive for the time period. But despite these advantages and nearly 70 years of continuous production, Colt manufactured fewer than 358,000 first-generation Single Action Army revolvers total. That averages to barely 5,000 revolvers per year across 7 decades of production. Hardly the mass production flooding that popular history suggests. For perspective that puts these numbers in context, Smith & Wesson manufactured over 35,000 Model 3 revolvers in just 8 years of production. The Peacemaker wasn't mass-produced to dominate markets. It was carefully crafted in relatively small numbers for discerning customers willing to pay premium prices. Its legendary fame far exceeded its actual production volume, creating a reputation built more on quality than quantity. You're witnessing the power of reputation over reality, legend over logistics, marketing over manufacturing output. And speaking of legendary fame, let's examine the most famous nickname in firearms history. Myth number 2, the gun that won the West. Marketing lie. You've heard the phrase countless times throughout your life, the gun that won the West. But you're unconsciously repeating a marketing slogan created in the 1950s, rather than quoting historical fact. In 1919, Winchester ran a full-page advertisement, boldly claiming their Model 1873 rifle was the gun that won the West. It was pure marketing genius, completely unprovable, but powerfully effective at selling rifles to Americans who wanted to own a piece of frontier mythology. Colt's marketing department recognized a winning formula when they saw one and adopted similar language for their revolver. By the 1950s, when Western television shows and movies were dominating American popular culture, the phrase had become embedded in the national consciousness. But the uncomfortable truth contradicts the compelling marketing copy. No single weapon won the American West. The frontier was actually settled by families carrying farming tools rather than firearms, railroad workers swinging sledgehammers instead of shooting irons, and miners wielding pickaxes rather than pistols. Firearms were simply one category of tools among many needed for survival and prosperity. The phrase became so deeply embedded in American cultural mythology that multiple generations assumed it represented historical fact rather than advertising creativity. It wasn't historical documentation, it was carefully crafted advertising copy that achieved accepted truth status through constant repetition across decades. The American West was won through backbreaking labor, not gunpowder and lead. You're believing in the power of commerce rather than the reality of conquest, embracing marketing mythology rather than historical truth. And finally, the biggest lie ever told about the most famous revolver in American history. Myth number 1, Wyatt Earp's legendary Buntline Special. You picture the legendary Wyatt Earp drawing his famous 12-inch barreled Buntline Special during the climactic gunfight at the OK Corral, but you're visualizing a completely fictional weapon that never existed in historical reality. In 1931, Stuart Lake published Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, a sensationalized biography that transformed the real Earp into a Western Superman for Depression-era readers hungry for heroic escapism. Lake needed a signature weapon worthy of his mythologized hero, something that would set Earp apart from ordinary lawmen. Lake invented the entire story of dime novelist Ned Buntline, commissioning 5 special long-barreled Colt revolvers for famous frontier lawmen, including Earp himself. It was complete fiction crafted to sell books, but the story was so compelling that readers accepted it as historical fact. Modern researchers have found 0 evidence that Buntline ever met Earp in person. No Colt factory records exist documenting such a special order. Most damning of all, during the supposed presentation ceremony in Dodge City, Earp wasn't even in Kansas. He was in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, mining for gold and simultaneously facing murder charges back in Dodge City. The myth proved so irresistibly compelling that Colt actually manufactured Buntline Special revolvers in the 1950s to capitalize on the popular television show The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp. They created real guns to match a fictional story, and collectors eagerly purchased them as historical replicas of weapons that had never existed in the first place. You're admiring reality, desperately trying to imitate pure fiction, commerce chasing mythology, rather than history. The Colt Single Action Army earned its rightful place in American history through solid engineering and reliable performance, not through the elaborate myths that surround it like Gunsmoke. It was fundamentally a working man's revolver that became a national icon, not because of what it actually was, but because of what successive generations wanted it to represent. The real story behind any legend is invariably more complex than the simplified version, and sometimes that complexity makes it infinitely more fascinating than the fiction. The American West wasn't won by any single firearm. It was built by ordinary people, flawed, determined, and utterly human individuals who happen to carry tools that have managed to outlive them all by more than a century. That's the truth Hollywood never bothered to tell you. And now, you finally know. Thanks for riding with us through the Wild West's biggest revolver myths. If you had a good time busting legends, give this video a thumbs up and share it with a fellow history buff. And don't forget, there are plenty more hidden stories to uncover, so hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Our next adventure into the untold frontier is one you won't want to miss.